Welcome back to Two Keanus, the second season of Critical and Curious. I am Charisse Laprie here at the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University, and joined, as I always am, by Bob Thompson. Hi, Bob.
Hey, how are you? I can't wait to talk about these two movies.
I'm excited. This time, we'll be talking about Cop Keanu in Point Break, 1991, and Speed, 1994. Now, admittedly, these two films are 3 years apart, but I think they also really add to the public understanding of Keanu Reeves as he attempted to simultaneously draw on Ted and break from Ted that we talked about last time. So let's jump straight into it. Let's talk a little bit about Point Break before we get into Speed, although I'm not gonna lie, I think Cop Keanu might be my favorite Keanu.
I've seen both of these films multiple times, but it's been a long time since I've seen them. And as a more mature adult, I have went back and really came to appreciate them. And there's so much continuity, as you point out, between Bill and Ted and these, but also between the genre of buddy film and cop film, in that both Point Break and Speed are not just buddy films, they're multiple buddy films. I mean, Point Break, released in 1991, I think the same year that
My Own Private Idaho.
My Own Private Idaho was released, and just a couple of years after Bill and Ted, is really two buddy films, and it's unusual because, spoiler alert, both the buddies die before this movie is over. So he starts out being buddies with this kind of more experienced, boss.
Gary Busey Pappas.
Gary Busey, which is one of my favorite Gary Busey roles. And he plays this kind of, older, experienced character, but they really get along.
Okay, fine, you've given up. Fine. It doesn't mean I have to.
Hey, listen. Forget about it, kid. They are ghosts.
Yeah, of course. What am I thinking? If you couldn't crack it with all your years of experience, it's impossible to conceive that I might have something to offer, right? Well, maybe I can do better than some over-the-hill burnout.
Hey, watch your mouth.
Maybe you ought to just take some early retirement right now and get some rent-a-cop night security job. Tell Nom stories.
Listen, you snot-nosed little shit. I was taking shrapnel and K-Son while you were crapping in your hands and rubbing it on your face.
You mad?
Yeah, I'm mad.
Good and mad?
Yeah, what do you want to do about it?
Feels good, doesn't it? Like you're still alive, right?
Yeah!
Well, since you're still alive and you're not in the box just yet, why don't you tell me this theory of yours and we'll go get these guys?
They both enjoy getting on the nerves of the typical stereotyped cop boss named Harp, of all things, I think.
Yes.
And he's always harping on them.
No. But let's do it anyway. It will bug the shit out of Harp.
My man.
Yeah.
And talk about Gary Busey's character's name. He's Angelo Pappas. It's double whammy. He's both his angel and he's his papa. And it works in both those ways. But then he has another buddy film as his undercover role, who's named Bodhi, which is an abbreviation for Bodhisattva, which is, of course, the kind of Buddha that could get to nirvana if they wanted to, but they're hanging around to teach us how to have better lives and be happier.
They don't have any real understanding of the sea, so they'll never get the spiritual side of it.
Hey, you're not gonna start chanting or anything, are you?
I might.
This is me.
So, you still haven't figured out what riding waves is all about, have you? It's a state of mind. It's that place where you lose yourself and you find yourself. You don't know it yet, but you got it. It's right there.
That's a pretty interesting 1-2 punch for a buddy film, especially a buddy film that is not going to end the way most buddy films end.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I had not thought of Pappas as a buddy, as Gary Busey as his buddy, but I completely agree. And, we were talking about this earlier, is Point Break Cop Keanu or is it Buddy Keanu? And I'm glad that we kept it as Cop Keanu because you really see a thread of his everyman in these cop narratives. And I also think that Point Break and Speed provide an interesting juxtaposition for this sort of cliche cop narrative. But in that same physicality, Patrick Swayze and technically Gary Busey, right, both have that light-haired, stocky answer to his tall, slim, dark physique in the same way that Alex Winter, Bill, and River Phoenix have in My Own Private Idaho. And I guess, you know, in the traditional buddy sense, the buddies are not antagonists. They may be antagonistic towards each other, but they're not antagonists. In the cop film, in what I think is a good cop film, the cop is perpetually dealing with his antithesis in the antagonist, right? That we would be best friends if we weren't both under these circumstances.
Right. And I think the Gary Busey, Keanu Reeves, those two, the Pappas relationship really does. I mean, and it doesn't get a lot of time to develop, but they really do become, I think, much more of a piece. So we have one buddy film in here where it's old versus young, experienced versus less experienced. But both of them want to get the job done. Both of them want to be away from the oppressive authority of their bosses. And then we get the relationship between the Bodhi, which is much more a spiritual one. And they, of course, are much more of the same age. But there is also this kind of almost predictable trope of the light versus the dark and all the rest of it.
Although Keanu is the dark and he is the light.
Yeah, and right, which is another way in which this film kind of messes with these traditional things. But what I also didn't think about with Point Break until I watched it this time around is that it's not only a cop film, it's not only a couple of buddy films, but it's also a seminar on acting. So this relationship between Johnny Utah and Bodhi is completely done where one of them he's invented a character with a backstory. My parents have both died, so we can get into Tyler's good graces.
Is that what we're calling it now, good graces?
That's what the kids call it these days. But we're essentially seeing him. There's two films. There's a film of him, going to solve this crime, and then there's a film when he goes into the surfer subculture.
Once he goes native.
That's exactly what this film, I think, is about. He becomes an actor. He's playing someone who he isn't, and he gets so into the role, like an awful lot of people that are method, that sometimes they can't escape. And by the end of this film, he throws in that real cliche, but we'll let that go, throws the badge into the ocean. By the way, how many times in the history of American television and film has that happened? About 400. But he rejects who he really is, Johnny Utah, whose parents are still alive somewhere in Ohio. And he has truly gone native, and that's much more the role he's comfortable in. And we see very nice indications in both his relationship with Pappas and his relationship with Bodhi as we go on. This is, I think, a film about how acting and being undercover can ultimately evolve, I should say, into another reality entirely.
Absolutely. So as we think through our questions, just to get a little bit more formal, first question I always ask you to think about is, who is Keanu's character in this movie, and what does he bring to this character? And I think in its most cliché sense, he's a tortured cop, right? And I appreciate the focus you have on Gary Busey, because Gary Busey for me just fell away. Like, I was full on Patrick Swayze and Keanu Reeves and totally forgot about the Busey-Reeves relationship because, much like Lethal Weapon, Gary's too old for this shit. And, but he himself is tortured in having to deal with HARP. He's the sort of cliche cop, Gary Busey. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves is by definition the young ingenue who's still eager and hopeful and going to learn how to surf so he can bag the cops. And the whole movie is cliche. I believe it's called a wet Western, right? That there's this antagonism that's moving throughout all of these spaces. And in it, Keanu Reeves is this innocent, kind of wholesome character that, if you were in the same position, you would do the same thing. And for me, that becomes so evident in one of the most I hate to use the word cliche again, but it's not cliche. One of the most seminal scenes in the movie is the foot chase. And when he's chasing Bodhi, with Bodhi in the Reagan mask, through the back alleys of Venice and Santa Monica, and then busts his knee and shoots his gun, empties the clip into the air. It's a real sympathetic character because he knows that this is his friend and he doesn't want to shoot him, but at the same time, he's trying to do work. But on a side note, I've seen this movie dozens of times. This was the first time I watched it and I legitimately got worried that Keanu Reeves would shoot Patrick Swayze in the back while he was running away, given all of our news coverage.
Oh, I'm glad that didn't happen.
Yeah, but at the same time, because it didn't happen, it reminds you that the character is much more in depth than just getting his man.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I saw that foot chase, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that really is, in many ways, the thesis statement of this film.
Yes.
For a couple of reasons. Gary Busey, his calling is to be a cop. He's been doing it too long. He's sick of it, but he could have done nothing else. The very nature of the universe has written that part for him, just as the writer of the film has written that part for him. Johnny Utah, on the other hand, with that ridiculous name, is obviously good at what he's doing. He's got this papa that's about to kind of take him under his arm for as long as he lives in this film. But it is clear that Johnny Utah has pursued the wrong calling. And he gets the opportunity, and rarely does this happen. Human beings often do the wrong thing. They never are happy. They wish at the end of their lives they'd have done something else. But this is a film, I think, all about where Johnny Utah gets to realize in the middle of this film that I shouldn't be a cop.
And he's surfing every day by the end of the film.
Right, that there is something else entirely that I was meant to do. And there's someone else entirely that I was meant to be with. So comes that foot chase. I see that not only as chasing after his prey, his adversary, but as his chasing after his new dream. And for that matter, and I don't think we're saying this too far, his new crush and his serious crush. That foot chase is a love scene. And how does it end? He empties the chamber. I mean, it's a very satisfying orgasm that ends this whole thing.
You want me so bad you can taste it like acid in your mouth.
Yes, the film is full of that stuff. Now, I don't mean to be some bad Freud 101 interpretation, but that foot chase is him running toward something new, surfing and Bodhi, and running away from something he's both good at and that pays the rent and all the rest of it that he doesn't belong in doing. And the rest of that film after that is how he figures out how to reconcile that. And by the end, he loses his love,
right.
But he also has escaped from what he needs to escape from. And then another scene I really like is when they all have jumped out of the plane. And they're in the Ring of Five.
Oh, yes.
And then the Ring of Five separates. And then Bodhi and Johnny have that whole thing about
1,000 feet, pull!
After you, Alphonse! I insist!
Pull the ripcord now!
You first!
Okay?
Son of a bitch!
I mean, if that isn't dialogue, that could very easily be, the two of them are kind of negotiating. It's kind of like two high school kids, you hang up, no, you hang up,
yeah.
no, you hang up. And then the more erotic, you come first, no, you come first. I mean, that kind of thing.
In the second dive, Keanu dives without a parachute, which I believe is also a sexual euphemism for condomless sex, right? He dives without a parachute.
You know, when one falls in love, how can that be more metaphorically powerful than literally falling? And the idea of orgasm as the little death. In this case, it's the big death as well.
And I'll make a point. I did not see it as sexual, even though I was sensitized to the sexuality of it. But you're absolutely right. That level of intimacy where they're clutching each other, falling through space.
Head over heels into love.
Head over heels, begging each other to pull the trigger first is deeply sexual.
Even when, after Bodhi knows that he's the law, and he forces him to participate in the last bank heist.
Oh, yeah.
He says, no, come along, you're going to do it.
I can't do this.
Sure you can. Who knows, you might like it. It's a killer rush.
And he's right. Johnny might like it. And Johnny gets into that a little more than at that one point when he makes that very threatening line to someone in it. The fact that he had totally liked the first jump when he had a parachute. The idea is that Johnny really is being seduced into this other lifestyle that is in so many ways the opposite of what the regimented, a boss named Harp, a papa named Pappas. I mean, that regimented thing about the cop. Think about, if you're watching this film and you're like 19 years old, which of these lifestyles would you prefer? And I think this film is subversive in that way. I have to say, even the very first time I saw this as a love story between. It starts as a cop buddy film between Pappas and Johnny, and then it becomes a romantic, not comedy, but a romantic adventure, whatever that means, between Johnny, who is completely just taken by the whole lifestyle, but also taken by Bodhi itself. And if you meet somebody named Bodhisattva, it's pretty hard not to be taken.
At the same time, that plea from Bodhi feels like the plea from Mike from River Phoenix.
Oh yes, does it ever?
At the fireplace, it's like, no, you might like it. Well, I don't do that. Oh well,
Yes.
I'm willing. Are you willing?
I'm so glad you brought that up because even though not all our main characters are in it, My Own Private Idaho, right around the same time as this was released, has a campfire scene that is crucial.
Yes.
And this has a campfire scene on the beach, but it also brings us back to that whole kind of Western narrative. Here there's surfers by the campfire. The Western has cowboys by the campfire, but that somehow when you talk about men and their relationships with each other, you can never get too far away from a campfire.
It's true. So then I think now would be a good time to talk about Catherine Bigelow, because I don't think, in all the times I've seen this movie over the past 25 years, I don't think I recognized or realized or appreciated that she was the director on this. A Rolling Stone interview says explicitly, talking about the female gaze, it says, "The male gaze objectifies, the female gaze humanizes. It reinforces the idea that the whole package, and not just an errant body part, is sexy, no matter what the gender identity is. And nowhere is this concept more evident than in Catherine Bigelow's 1991 wet western Point Break, a film that redefined the action genre with two key elements: intimacy and equality. Laugh all you want. This is the greatest female gaze action movie ever."
Okay, I'd have to give that some thought before I would give it the greatest ever. But I agree in principle on this whole thing.
Well, what she's bringing to it, and the fact that we can unpack these characters as emotional beings as opposed to just goal-oriented, headstrong, masculine figures is absolutely attributable to her, not just in the script, but in the presentation of the bodies and the sexualization of the surfing alone. Like it's in the foot chase and the sort of metaphoric orgasm when he doesn't get what he wants, I have to talk about Bigelow. I have to talk about what she brings to this narrative as opposed to other cliched action buddy cop movies that existed before or since.
Yes. I mean, let's put it this way. I think this would have been a very different film if James Cameron would have directed it. And I think I wouldn't be nearly as excited about talking about it if James Cameron had directed it.
On that note, I believe this was in the theater at the same time as Terminator 2, which was Cameron's.
Right, and Cameron, of course, has got relationships here as well. And again, I don't know how much Catherine Bigelow had in messing with the script, But there is a point of view and a voice in this film that I think is very different than the typical cop film, the typical buddy film. Just like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which was also directed by a woman, had a very different feel from all of the Animal Houses and all of the John Hughes films and all the rest of it. When we talk about Catherine Bigelow, I think we don't often talk about Point Break. You had pointed out that you had kind of forgotten that she directed it, and I had kind of forgotten that too. But now watching it, it's clearly part of that. It's clearly her voice that is in this in lots of very identifiable places.
On that note, and then we could talk a little bit about Speed, because I think the physical presence and the body of Keanu Reeves plays such an important role in both films in such drastic opposition. So in Point Break, we see the scar. The scar comes back in that shot in the bed with Tyler, again, where they're to come back to that intimacy and equality, like her boyishness is tied to his femininity, and he's lying on his back and you see the scar. So again, much like Van Zandt in a homoerotic narrative, they are willing to foreground this scar. And I think that also demonstrates not only a vulnerability of character, but also a vulnerability of the director. Alternatively, in Speed, he never takes off his shirt, and yet somehow is still this incredibly sexualized character without necessarily having to show skin.
Yeah, and here's where, we're academics and we like to use rational methods and science and all the rest of it. But sometimes, science just doesn't need to apply. It's show business. And again, I've said this before, I don't want to sound like somebody on American Idol or whatever, but Keanu Reeves has got a thing that only showbiz can, I think, explain, is that he really, really looks fabulous on screen. And it's, I'm sure, some combination of his face, his body, the way that he has managed to make himself move. And if there's any continuity across all these films, because these films have different directors, totally different genres, from goofy Bill and Ted to Shakespeare, My Own Private Idaho, and then even a Shakespeare play later. I mean, you could have a wider range of things, but the one unifying continuity is this actor who really does kind of chew up the scenery. Short of saying he's really attractive, he's got charisma, I think it is hard. And for all of Richard Dyer and his whole book on star studies, nobody, I think, has ever been able to quite identify what that charisma is. We, like the whole definition of pornography, we know it when we see it, but or obscenity, whatever that was defining. But it is really hard to rationalize what exactly that is. But in both of those films, as you point out, shirt off, shirt on, it doesn't matter. That whole dynamic, there's a property of Keanu Reeves' acting that is very important to all of these films.
So then let's come to Speed. First of all, we have to include the Speed overture. The minute that music started again, I was immediately transported to whenever it was the first time I saw it, and as that slow pan down the elevator shaft from the speaking of sexual overtones, that slow pan down the elevator shaft.
I know, slow pan down the shaft.
With that overture, I got excited for this film all over again. I had the dumbest grin on my face watching it. I forgot how much I absolutely love this movie. And on a personal note, I think I really appreciate films that are simply investigations into an event, right? Because here, in the case of Point Break, we have this complex character, this tortured Keanu who doesn't know who he really is. And to be fair, on his acting chops, and I apologize for bringing up Point Break again, but let me just mention this one thing. He tells Tyler this story. And the only thing we know about his backstory, the only thing we know it to be false is that his parents are alive. We don't know whether he went to law school. We don't know if that's why he got involved in all of these things. He makes Tyler believe it, and I believed it while I was watching him.
Me
right?
too.
So he gives this extensive backstory.
I believed it even the third time I watched it.
He gives this extensive backstory. He's a football player. Maybe he went to law school. All of these things. We come to Speed, and you know nothing of his character. It is free from any psychological implications, as are most action films. This is a nice guy who's a cop who needs to solve this problem, and we are going to solve this problem. We don't know anything about where he came from. We don't know anything about what he wants out of life. We know that he's single, and that's it.
Right, he talks in these staccato,
Yes.
Almost like a medical drama where get those we need a lidocaine stat kind
Right.
of thing. There is a very scientific part of it, but I have to say, this is 1994, and I think this was the film. This is a really wonderful film. I think for a fast-moving action film, this does it about as elegantly as you can expect. But it's also one of those films, and what was that colleague of yours said, how could somebody like Keanu
How can such a bad actor be in so many good movies?
It's because he's not a bad actor, but he's right that these are so many good movies. And Speed is one of those that I think, this got good reviews. Most people, and I think sometimes grudgingly said it's really good at what it does. I think Roger gave it a 4 stars or something.
4 out of 4.
Yeah. So it's not like they were quite making the same fun of it as they were Bill and Ted. But let's face it, Speed, I keep bringing up, Speed is never confused with a Meryl Streep movie. Meryl Streep would have never been in Speed. It was considered a really well done pleasure, but a lot of people use that guilty pleasure. We shouldn't feel guilty at all about watching this film. I think this is an extraordinary film, and I think by '94 we realize that this Keanu Reeves fellow is a force to be reckoned with. And I think we first get so there's this big elevator thing, and the credits. Opening credits play. Before we hear a word of dialogue from Keanu, he is in a flying car. He does that big, they pack up the trunk, they go to this place where the elevator thing was happening, and there's this whole thing where he's in a car that's flying, which is, of course, predicting, because a bus is going to fly pretty soon, which, by the way, he's not going to be driving. The woman is going to be driving. But anyway, so they're even in that beginning. But what I realized in watching this again, and I've seen this film many times with great pleasure, is that it is like 3 different movies.
Yes.
The first 27 minutes, we don't see anything of Sandra Bullock. It's an elevator story. And by the way, 27 minutes is about what a 30-minute drama would be. You could stop this at their party when they both get drunk, after they get their award.
Yes.
And you'd have a perfectly exciting movie with big stars and all the rest of it. So there's no bus. This is Speed, and there's no bus in the first 27 minutes.
Although the elevator does speed down the shaft.
Well, yeah, with great speed. But that's the elevator disaster movie, which is enough to do a disaster. Then you've got this nice little interlude. And by the way, that's the buddy movie with
Jeff Daniels.
Keanu's character and Harry.
Right.
Jeff Daniels' character, right. Then we have this little interlude that goes for about 10 minutes, from 27 minutes to about 38 minutes. And that's the part where you got to keep the bus below 50 because you don't want it to go above 50 to start it. And that's a second buddy film, and one that I think people don't talk enough about.
With the fellow in the Jag.
The Jaguar guy, Glenn Plummer.
You scratch this puppy, and me and you are gonna have words. You understand?
That is a really wonderful 11 minutes of film.
It's good.
And he at first, don't touch, this is my Jag, this is, obviously this guy this is the love of his life, this car. And by the end, when Keanu starts doing these fabulous moves in the street, he starts really getting into it, just like we saw in Point Break. Then by 11 minutes, he's gone. But that's film number 2 in Speed that is worth going back and looking at.
And I love, actually, because it's not something I noticed. I mean, I'm sure I noticed it, but it's not till the second time that you see that Jag passes him on the road.
Yes,
and then he catches up to it later and uses it.
And then you have your third movie,
which is
the action-adventure, which is almost a parody. Because let's face it, this is happening on a bus.
But you're not counting the train as a fourth movie?
Oh, no, I'm getting to the fourth. I'm only the third. So what we think of as Speed is only about an hour long.
Yeah.
It's from about 38 minutes in to about an hour and a half. It's not even a full hour.
And there's that solid ending where they roll out and they have that emotional, romantic moment. Like, that feels like an ending.
So we've got action-adventure in the beginning with the elevator. We've got comic relief with the Jaguar guy. We've got the actual film itself, which is a comic, almost parody action-adventure. The Big Bus, well, that was 1976. The idea that you'd put an action-adventure in a bus is itself hilarious. And then you've got the romantic comedy that takes place in the end, which is we get a subway out of control. I always have to think back as to how that actually happened. So elevator, bus, subway. This movie in how long is it? An hour and 55 minutes or something? This movie covers a lot of things. 3 different kinds of vehicular things out of control. And that ending is because their relationship has been actually a really interesting one throughout the bus disaster. And it hasn't been a romantic comedy. And it switches on a dime once she gets strapped in. I guess you have to strap explosives onto a woman before you can really start turning everybody on.
What are you going to do? Strap her to the train?
Right, exactly.
Literally?
Exactly. Roger Ramjet or whatever that used to be called. Yeah, it's one step from being strapped to the rails of the train. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a very nice observation. So once that happens, the romantic comedy starts. But what I like about it is they leave it for the end.
Let's just get it
so
done.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
That last line is so not romantic comedy. There's no love here.
I have to warn you. I've heard relationships based on intense experiences never work.
Okay. We'll have to base it on sex then.
Whatever you say, ma'am.
And of course, we know from Speed 2, if anybody has sat through Speed 2, which congratulations if you've managed that, that their relationship based on intense things doesn't last.
I remember, as much as I love Speed, I hated the ending. I always hated the ending, which is just like the most cliche. They've survived the trauma, and now they're clutched next to each other, and there's a kiss, and then there's a slow pan out. And I'm like, man, it wasn't a romantic comedy, and I hate romantic comedies, and we will talk more about that when we get to romantic Keanu. I hate romantic movies. But in watching it in this moment, I had a less visceral response to it because it happens on Hollywood Boulevard. It's a Hollywood ending where they burst
right
onto
across
Hollywood
from
Boulevard.
the Chinese theater, or
yep.
what used to be called the Chinese theater.
And, everybody's watching, and it just seems very self-aware in its cliche. And I'll take it.
I agree. I am willing to. This show is one string of cliches after another. And I think the best way to look at Speed is a really, really exciting, fun parody. And if we get no other clues to that, it happens on a bus.
Yeah.
This is 1994. If you're going to do a disaster movie, it's a bus. Might as well do it on a stagecoach.
Yeah. I'll make this point that I really wanted to bring up. So this is the first time I was watching both of these films since living in LA. And you know how it is when you see a movie, you love the movie, then you go and lived in the city, it's a completely different thing. So that whole opening elevator scene is shot literally around the corner from my house. The surfing at the power plant, I totally used to surf there when I dated a surfer living in LA.
You surfed?
Yeah. It was
Yikes.
It was not pretty.
You dated a surfer?
I dated a surfer.
Full of secrets you are.
And the intersection where they jump the bus over the gap, I spun out my Honda Civic at that exact intersection and totaled my car.
Because it wasn't finished?
No, maybe. I think I just missed some Mylar in the street, but. it was, it's just such a joy to watch all of those things. And like Pershing Square, that's around the corner from my house, So watching all of these things, I think, to come back to the same conversation we had around Fast and Furious, very few LA-based movies take you through the diversity of LA. You go from downtown to the airport. If you combine this with Point Break, you see the surfing, right? And the airport pulls off about 2 miles north of the power plant where they go to find the surfers because of the toxins in the water. As you see these two conversations together, like, they just feel like two parts of one whole. And I think that for me, that's one of the most fun parts about A Star Study, is seeing how one actor tells one narrative across multiple wildly different films.
Yeah, that's a really, really nice observation. And I don't have the experience. I've been to LA many times, but I have not dated a surfer. I have not been in LA. But I still think this is one of the great LA movies.
Yes.
And one of them is the constant metaphor of the fact that LA is unfinished.
Yes.
Of course, it's on the West Coast. You can't get any further than that when you're going from sea to shining sea and the Manifest Destiny and all the rest of it. But not only once, but twice. They got to jump the unfinished road with the bus, and then there's the unfinished subway as well. So the idea that LA is never done. And I think that's a pretty nice metaphor for LA as well. And then the whole, she's driving the bus, but her license has been suspended.
For speeding.
Which is so beautiful. And when he says, "Can you drive this?" It's just like driving a big Pinto.
Yeah.
As someone who has driven not one, but two Pintos, 72 and a 78, which at the time I didn't know would blow up, which is, of course, how this starts, a bus blowing up, and they have to worry about it. The elegant way in which this is so worked out, a quick reference to a Pinto which blows up when a bus is about to blow up, that's really nice. This is not just a, action adventure. This is a really, I think, poetic film. And one other thing, and I'm now completely stream of consciousness, so shut me up if you'd like to. But when all the cops are in front of the bus and behind the bus in that kind of formation of three on each side or whatever, that immediately reminded me on this viewing, of course, of the Bronco chase.
Yes.
O.J. Simpson's Bronco chase, June 17th, 1994. Speed, I think, was released June 10th, 1994. So that shows how well they were already nailing the actual spirit of L.A.
The zeitgeist of the city.
Yes, even before, they predicted the Bronco chase.
Yeah.
Bronco chase was slower, but
the same
it
format.
was the same format, the same compositions.
And, our understanding of L.A. is very much couched in celebrity catastrophe. And I feel like even though we like to think of that as post-OJ, we see that it was very much in the awareness of de Bont. So de Bont is the director in this one. And, he's famous for being DP, right? This is one of his first actual directorial endeavors, right? So he was the DP on Die Hard. And so, he's bringing a DP perspective. Like, it is a long, moving picture, and the dialogue seems almost inconsequential. It's a bunch of pithy one-liners. It's like a good comeback,
the catchphrases every minute.
Every minute, In fact, as I was trying to think, because last time we closed the episode with a little Bill and Ted, be excellent to each other. And so I was looking for good quotes from both of these films. And it's worthwhile to note that Keanu does not have the best quotes in these films. In Point Break, it's definitely Bodhi.
If you want the ultimate, you gotta be willing to pay the ultimate price. It's not tragic to die doing what you love.
I think I'm going to have that woven onto a pillow and put it on my couch.
And
Harry got a couple of good ones. They're giving you a medal for shooting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Harry's definitely got some good ones. But my favorite line in Speed is uttered by Dennis Hopper.
Interactive TV, Jack. Wave of the future. Ha ha ha, huh?
Okay, well, first of all, you are so right about that. I mean, on one level, this is such a stupid movie. The continuity errors. In one scene, the bus has a zebra with a zoo thing on the side of it. In another scene, the same side of the bus doesn't have it.
I thought it fell off.
Well, but then it comes back again.
Oh, well, then, never mind.
And if it fell off, it would have fell off from scraping. I mean, okay, I'll give you that. Although I love that back thing, which stays there, that money is everything, which,
Yes.
of course, is exactly what... So there's continuity issues. Could you really be going straight for that long in an airport to do the whole thing with him going in the dolly underneath? But that's not how we assess films. Anybody who's got problems with that shouldn't be watching a movie like this.
Although, to be fair, Mythbusters has hit both of these movies.
Yes, I know they have.
And they busted those myths.
But that's what I think, and you've pointed this out. What's so fun about this is it throws the cliches out, and there is a potential catchphrase like every 3 minutes in this thing. But that can be fun if it's done within the artistic framework that is so carefully done as this is. As far as what Keanu brings to this, I have to say it's just, once again, it's almost like they're showing off that Keanu can both be a buddy cop guy with Harry in the beginning, a kind of romantic comedy type in the middle, but certainly in the end. I mean, he plays a lot of different kinds of roles here. But as you point out, unlike in Point Break, and unlike to some extent in My Own Private Idaho, there is so little character development here, because this is not about character development. This is about the title of the film. It's about speed. This is watching a little less than 2 hours of a film that is just going to keep delivering over and over and over again. And it turns out Keanu's as good as that as doing time travel, at doing street people and hustling in Portland. It's by 94, you've got to kind of think, okay, this guy has really got some range, even though all of these parts, he kind of comes off pretty much as the same guy. The big thing in Speed, where they really went out on the limb, is he's got no bangs. He's got really short hair.
A point that Johnston makes is he falling into these roles, or is his acting so good that he makes it look simplistic? And if we can't distinguish between the two,
then does it?
Who gets that credit? Do we default and say he's falling into it, or do we default and say he's working his butt off? And as we will discuss moving forward, like, he immerses himself in every single role. He does research that's above and beyond the other actors that are present. He works so hard to make it look so easy, and we don't give him, in our popular sentiment, our popular understanding of Keanu Reeves, we don't give him that credit.
I think you're right. This is a big epistemological question about acting, which is that if you can't tell the difference between one or the other, then how does that really matter? Which is why I'm glad you chose to spend this much time on Keanu Reeves, because I think Keanu Reeves deserves that kind of credit. He makes it look absolutely effortless. And we will eventually get to his Shakespeare.
Yes.
His actual Shakespeare, not his sort of Shakespeare that he did in Private Idaho. And he does that same thing. He makes it sound like he's just like reading Shakespeare. But he's doing that in one of my favorite Shakespeare adaptations of all time.
Yeah, his Shakespearean directors have repeatedly said that his knowledge of Shakespeare is encyclopedic. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because we'll talk about classic Keanu next time. But, his desire to play Hamlet, when he met with the director, involved knowing all 1,530 lines of Hamlet, as well as the lines of the other characters. His ability to make connections between Hamlet and Shakespeare's other films, which any good Shakespearean scholar is going to do. Those dots are connected ad infinitum. And he is willing and eager to do that same amount of work. Just because it doesn't look like he's doing the work, that would to me, generally be a mark in his favor.
That's good acting.
That's good acting.
Okay, I'm going to say something really hyperbolic now.
Okey
You
doke.
can take this or leave it. But it occurred to me that there's a comparison with Keanu Reeves and Orson Welles. They're very different in one way, in that Orson Welles was immediately kind of called a genius. He was doing Shakespeare at 25, that Voodoo Macbeth in New York, and of course Citizen Kane when he was still in his 20s. Orson Welles was considered a genius, but he never actually after that was able to make successful films in Hollywood. Keanu Reeves is not considered a genius, but has consistently made one really extraordinarily good film after another in all kinds of different genres, from the goofy Bill and Ted to the silly Speed to the serious My Own Private Idaho. And it's odd how you've got these two, and I'm willing to go so far as to say geniuses, one who everybody appreciated as such, but could never actually get his films completed. Well, not never, but, and another who nobody, well, not nobody, but who a lot of people never took that seriously, but who has now left us this extraordinary body of work.
Absolutely.
And both of them, of course, were really into Shakespeare.
And I think to visit one of our questions for Speed, you know, what does Keanu bring to this character is, and I've said it before, I'll say it again, this kind of quiet everyman. That same colleague that made a pithy comment, you know, as I was thinking about it, he's not a bad actor. One might argue he is this sort of multiracial Gen X Richard Dreyfuss, this sort of everyman character that you can lay anything on. And the fact that he has no backstory makes him all the more everyman in this one. That he is has a heart of gold, he has good intentions, and you know that he will do whatever he has to do to save the girl, support his friend, and catch the bad guy in both of these films. So for me, what does Keanu Reeves bring to this role? He brings a level of attractiveness, which we've already talked about, as well as a physicality in Speed. His attractiveness, frankly, only serves as comic relief with Sandra Bullock, with Mac, Joe Morton, with Harry, right? He's just this young, pretty boy. With Harp, he's just this young, pretty boy over and over, and it's hilarious. But his physicality is much bigger than his face, right? And that physicality, for me, to come back to a key point in Speed, you're introduced to him as he figures out the problem with the elevator and figures out how to catch it from the crane to take the hostages out of the equation. And in it, you see him dropping down the shaft.
Tell me again, Harry. Why did I take this job?
Oh, come on. 30 more years of this, you get a tiny pension and a cheap gold watch.
Cool. Oh.
With that hook in that perfect sort of
Upside down
in that skydiving, that controlled skydive,
yes.
to save a dozen people in a busted elevator. When we stop to think about what he brings to this character, I think what's important is to think about the other characters or the other actors who were in line for this role. So, which include Val Kilmer, Charlie Sheen, Tom Cruise,
Wesley Snipes,
right? All of these individuals.
Woody Harrelson, Tom Hanks.
Yes, all of these individuals would have brought a very different narrative. And what I think is most impressive about Keanu Reeves is he's none of those things. He doesn't bring baggage except for the baggage that we have put upon him as Ted.
Yeah, amen to that, yes. I think you're absolutely right. Ted was the movie that first brought him to huge international attention, and he has never quite shaken Ted. But as you, I think, just pointed out, I think is what you're saying, is that might have been a real asset to him.
Absolutely.
Because by not being taken seriously, by not becoming a thespian and Meryl Streep and Olivier, he's been able to do all this other stuff. By the way, the elevator.
Yes.
He starts with and I think you are right. There's all this, he's a regular guy, he's one of us,
Although if I can make one note, that if I had any character note, that chewing of the gum, and he doesn't bring it back, but in the very first scene, he's chewing gum, and it really feels like he just quit smoking. That's like the only
interesting.
backstory I can come up for him at that point.
And you have to read between those lines.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
But then because she's smoking gum.
Right. We
Sandra
first meet
Bullock
her
is chewing
when
gum.
the bus driver Sam
tells her to put out her
yeah.
cigarette, right? And instead she chews gum.
No, the bus driver Bob. No, yeah, bus driver. Oh,
Sam
yeah, right.
makes
right.
her put out a cigarette. Bob dies.
By the way,
and his
can
friends
I bring
with.
a little bit of something about Bob?
Please.
Having the name Bob,
Yes.
which has become kind of a joke. This has two Bobs, and both of them presumably start the disaster. At the very beginning in the elevator, there's that goofy, stupid guy who keeps pushing the button.
Nice job, Bob.
Exactly. And then when the whole thing goes bad, what button did you push, Bob? That's what starts that whole disaster. And then when we meet the first bus he's going to die in that bus that doesn't have passengers. His name is also Bob as well, which we hear Keanu's character talk about. So there's this sense that somehow all bad things that happen start with people named Bob. And by the way, ever see Twin Peaks? Who was the devil in Twin Peaks? Wow, Bob. Wow. Guy named Bob.
Wow. Bob.
I'd have to change my name.
So then, before we call it a day, as you hear, the bells have stopped ringing, therefore we are almost out of time. Taking these two together and juxtapose with Bill and Ted and My Own Private Idaho, who is Keanu Reeves in the public imagination by the end of 1994?
Well, My Own Private Idaho was a specialized thing.
Yes.
Not a whole lot of people saw that. However,
although I forgot to mention, I apologize, it is worthwhile to note that River Phoenix dies during the filming of Speed. And the way in which that impacts...
I don't think I know that.
Yeah, he dies during Speed, and... DeBont, the director, makes adjustments to Keanu's shooting schedule for him to grieve. He didn't eliminate the work, but, gave him larger chunks of time between shoots. And the discussion around Keanu Reeves and his emotionality, especially with River Phoenix's death, becomes a big piece of the interviews. Every time he does an interview for Speed, everyone keeps asking him, well, how does this make you feel? What is it like to miss River Phoenix? And at some point, he's like, they just want grief on demand. They want to ask you a question. They want you to start crying right then and there. But his grieving process is, again, that sort of quiet solitude. And I think that because it was such an emotionless character, although to be fair, the death of Harry is the reaction when he finds out that Harry dies, for me, is probably my favorite moment in the movie, because he breaks the phone.
Totally wigs out.
He wigs out. Everybody on the bus who's been holding on to him as an anchor starts to panic, because suddenly this character who had no emotion has nothing but emotion. And I think that scene is a testament to Keanu Reeves's quietness.
I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. That is probably the scene that is most out of place in this entire movie, where he's this kind of almost scientific, he's almost got a little bit of Mr. Spock in these staccato sentences, Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, when what's going to stop this elevator?
The basement?
The basement, he says, which is a completely rational sort of thing. I believe that's the first line he utters after he drives the flying car and moves into things. So when he finds out that Harry, the first of the three buddy films that this movie represents, has died, it's like, what is this? This is now a whole other movie, because you're right, he starts breaking things. And then everybody else who he's been the kind of father figure, the one keeping under control, has to say, we need you. It's like telling Dad, you can't leave us now. You need to whatever.
I believe that's Sandra Bullock's exact line.
Yes.
We need you here.
Right, and that is a powerful, powerful thing. I had not thought of that in relationship to the death of River Phoenix, but now that makes perfect sense. It makes that scene even more moving.
Telling, yeah.
So My Own Private Idaho, again, was a specialty kind of thing, but we've got now at the end of 1994 him playing this history, family-friendly dude on Bill and Ted. And then we get Point Break, where he also says the word dude, but that's almost a much more mature Ted in that.
It's like Ted is his alter ego in Point Break.
Yes, very good. And then we get Speed, which shows he can do a good old-fashioned romp in the action-adventure thing. And I almost see him emerging like John Wayne, who, everybody knew him as a cowboy. Maybe that's the Ted version of Keanu Reeves. But he then played a lot of other sorts of characters, which he would then emerge and continue to do throughout his career. So I think by 1994, I think we all still think of Keanu Reeves as Ted.
A little grown-up Ted.
Yeah, well, but we all still think of him as saying, awesome and dude and all that kind of thing. But he's clearly, by 1994, which is only 5 years after Bill and Ted, showing that he's got all kinds of other range, which we would continue to see and we will continue to talk about until he gets to, and I don't know whether to call this the great betrayal or the great apotheosis, but until he gets to John Wick, when he starts playing a character that that Hollywood has been slouching toward for a long, long time, which is ultra-violence.
On that note, we should call it a day, because we have so much more to discuss, and we will discuss over the next 8 episodes. Next time, we'll be talking about classic Keanu. We will take a slight departure from the 2 Keanu model and get into the 3 Keanu model. We will be talking about Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, Much Ado About Nothing, 1993, and Little Buddha, 1994. All of these films come between Point Break and Speed, so we're going to look a little bit backwards, specifically at Keanu's effort to be taken as a serious actor with these 3 roles, but at the same time, the way the public kind of discarded these roles in a desperate attempt to continue to see Ted in Keanu. As always, a special thank you to our producer, Lizzie Goldsmith. And before we go, as we already said, Keanu doesn't have too many great lines in these films, so let's go back to our method in the first season where we close with a question. Okay, Bob, Speed or Point Break?
Speed is more fun to watch. Point Break is a way better movie. So I suppose if I were the old stranded on a desert island with only one VHS tape, I guess it'd be Point Break. Point Break I could watch over and over again. Speed, I've got a sneaking suspicion after the 3rd time, might start getting a little old.
But Speed has 3 movies in it.
Speed does have 3 movies in it.
That's right.
Not any of which are masterpieces.
Fair enough.
But it is true. No, that is true. The great thing about Speed is you could stop it at different points in the film and have a perfectly coherent experience.
I would have said Point Break before we watched these. Now I'm really leaning towards Speed.
Now that's interesting because I actually appreciate Point Break way more now than I did before we started these conversations. So my Point Break's gone up in my estimation.
Well, then I can't wait to hear your opinion of classic Keanu next week.